Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Shiny Show. I found this tag on Jack in the Book's channel, and I've mentioned him down below in the description and linked his video for this in the description as well. And then I found the prompts on a blog post from As Told by Zariha, and again I've linked that blog post down below in the description. And I also included about 8 extra prompts that I felt also would work well with this tag, and I am tagging 2 other booktube channels which I'll mention at the end of the video. With all that said, let's get into this book tag. So the first prompt is Amateur Baker, a self-published book. That one for me is Lore of the Wilds by Annalise Sabrana. I read an arc of this. I absolutely loved it. And I reread it when it came out. Again, absolutely loved it. And it includes a magic library. We have fae princes and a human. Who wouldn't want that? The next prompt is Soggy Bottom, a book with a great start but disappointing end. And that for me is Go the Distance by Jen Kalanita, a Disney twisted tale that answers the question, what if Meg had to become a Greek god? Honestly, it has a great premise and it does have a pretty decent start, but the end was just disappointing. Like, it starts getting a little bit disappointing midway through the book. Even like a third of the way in, there was only one plot line that I cared about. I'm not gonna spoil that just because it's pretty obvious right off the bat what that plot line is, and that was the only one I cared about. Definitely a disappointing end, sadly. The next prompt is Bin Gates, a book you grew frustrated with and had to DNF. This one for me was Sky in the Deep by Adrienne Young. When I saw the cover of this, I wasn't seeing it at this size. I was seeing like the audiobook and ebook cover in the Libby app, so I was seeing a very sized down version of the cover. I thought this was like the Grim Reaper with an axe and like some gold hues, and I didn't see the face. So I was like, okay, Sky in the Deep, a story about the Grim Reaper set on like the Vikings or something. I was highly disappointed. Again, it was one of those situations where it had a very interesting concept. The beginning part was okay, and then I got maybe 20-25% of the way through and I just couldn't with it anymore because there were just too many things where I was like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And unlike with Go the Distance, the previous book, there wasn't really anything that I was invested in for Sky in the Deep, so I just decided to DNF it. The next prompt is Junior Bake Off, a children's book. I did start watching Junior Bake Off and I wanted to continue it, but I just never got around to continuing it. But for a children's book, for me, that would be, this is so beat up. I've had this for forever. It's Japanese children's favorite stories, compiled by Florence Sakade and illustrated by Yoshisuke Kurosaki. I know there's like a second one with a green. I loved these stories as a kid and the illustrations. The next prompt is Hollywood Handshake, a book that impressed you. And for me, that is When You Wish Upon a Star, a twisted tale by Elizabeth Lim. And this twisted tale answers the question of what if the blue fairy was not supposed to help Pinocchio. I love this. I was thoroughly happily surprised by this book. I'm not a big fan of Pinocchio. Like, it's not my favorite Disney movie. I just really did not like Pinocchio when I was growing up, and even today I'm kind of like about it. The only Pinocchio movie that I've liked was the Guillermo del Toro rendition that came out like last year, I think. I loved that one, but that's like an exception. And then this book, I read it, again, another exception. I did really like this story, which was a surprise and a happy one. The next prompt is Signature Challenge, a book you'd recommend to friends and family. That book is Six Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim, another Elizabeth Lim book. I love her work, and with Six Crimson Cranes, I had heard about it because a lot of the promotion I was seeing about it was that it was a Wild Swans retelling, and I absolutely love that story. I've watched the Mikhail Baryshnikov's stories from my childhood animation of the Wild Swans. I love that. I also know of a Jim Henson storyteller episode short where it's the Three Ravens and basically the same story, which I also love. So when I heard that this was a retelling of that, I was just like, I'm gonna love this book. I need to get it. I read it and I absolutely loved it. The next prompt is Technical Challenge, books you read without knowing much about them, ranked from worst to best. The books I'm gonna focus on here are As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katu, Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, and then The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirhafi by Shannon Chakrabarti Puppetry. I'm probably saying that wrong. And then ranking them from worst to best, I would do the reverse, which would be, this would be in third place, The Adventures of Amina El Sirafi. And then in second place would be Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. And then first place would be As Long as Lemon Trees Grow. I was super invested in the story. I absolutely loved it. The next prompt is Showstopper Challenge, a book or series that is an all-time favorite. And initially I was going to include Lord of the Rings in this, but I was doing Lord of the Rings for the next prompt. So I chose Almost There by Farrah Rochon, another Disney twisted tale. And this one answers the question of what if Tiana accepted the deal from Dr. Facilier. I knew I was going to love this. It's an all-time favorite. I love Princess and the Frog. I'm so excited for the ride. The next prompt is The Finalists, a favorite trilogy. And as I mentioned in the previous prompt, for me that trilogy is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I love this trilogy. I love the movies. I try to read it once a year. The series has meant so much to me. And then the last of the regular prompts is An Extra Slice, a favorite companion book. This is a little bit of a cheat because I don't have any actual companion books, but I'm going to count A Twisted Tale anthology edited by Elizabeth Lim. This is a collection of short stories that answer what if questions for various Disney movies. These are what if questions that wouldn't have worked necessarily as full-blown novels. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I have included 8 extra prompts, which I'm about to start doing right now. These aren't necessary to do as part of the tag, but if you would want to do them, please feel free to. A Dozen Bakers, a book that got you into reading or reading again. And the reason why I did this prompt was because a lot of the bakers, not a lot of them, but there were quite a few bakers. One I can think of was Chiggs. I'm blanking on the season he was in right now. He went to the finals, and when he had started his season of the Great British Bake Off, he had like just gotten into baking. So A Dozen Bakers, a book that got you into reading or into reading again. And for me, that book was The Paris Orphan by Natasha Lester. At the time that I read this, I was solely reading history, nonfiction, and mythology. I was still reading, but I wasn't really reading. I was reading for enjoyment. This is so hard to explain. Like I was reading for enjoyment, but at the same time, it's like I wasn't really reading fully for enjoyment. It was like partly for enjoyment, partly because I enjoyed learning through the books that I was reading, the history books that I was reading. But it was also tying into the fact that I was getting a history degree and I wanted to get a history degree. There was that tie-in and that expectation that I'd set on myself. And it is perfectly okay to read from 1 to 2 genres. That is perfectly fine. And if that's something you do, perfectly okay. Once I read The Paris Orphan, I basically rediscovered my love of reading fiction and my love of reading fantasy and romance to some extent. Romance I have a hit and miss relationship with, but I rediscovered my love of just reading for the sake of reading because I read The Paris Orphan, and I basically got back into reading again because of this, or I got back into reading other genres because of it. The next prompt is A Baker's Dozen, because there have been quite a few seasons where they've done A Baker's Dozen, and this prompt is the 13th book you've read this year, or if you haven't read 13 or more books this year, what is the 13th book you want to read? At the time I'm recording this, I've hit 40 books, 41 books. Slight disclaimer, it is not a flex that I've read